Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Caregivers conversation. We are back with another episode, and I've got a very special guest that I'm very excited about. Debra Whitman is joining us. She is the author of The Second 50, Answers to the 7 Big Questions of Midlife and Beyond. Deb is also AARP's Chief Policy Officer, so we're going to ask her a little bit about that. And we are so fortunate to have her here today. So thank you, Deb, for joining us.
Thanks, Bruce, for having me.
And I'm really looking forward to getting into this book because I'm kind of in your audience, perhaps, of someone who's starting to think about retirement and what the rest of my life is going to look like, the second half, the second 50. And so I'm wondering, why did you write this book, and what do you hope the readers will get out of it?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here at AARP Washington. I am a Washingtonian. Spent my youth over on the eastern part of the state near the Grand Coulee Dam and went to Gonzaga, so I'm so happy to be back. But after I left Gonzaga, I started working on aging issues. I worked at the Social Security Administration. I worked in the Senate on health care. I ran the Senate Aging Committee, and I've worked at AARP for a decade. So 25 years I was working on aging. And then I realized my 50th birthday was about to hit, and I realized how much I didn't know. And I looked at my shelf and I saw What to Expect When You're Expecting, and my kids were going off to college, so I had tons of books about that, but not What to Expect When You're Aging. And so I wanted to learn for myself, and I thought other people could find it useful. And so I wrote down the questions that I had about my future, and those are the chapters of the book.
One of the things I thought is that this is a very practical book because you ask some very pointed questions, and I'll just run through them. They are: how long will I live? Will I be healthy? Will I lose my memory? How long will I work? Will I have enough money? Where will I live? And how will I die? All questions that I have myself. Some seem, a little more pertinent right now, but all of them serious. Were there any of those 7 questions that particularly resonated either with you or the people that you've talked to for the book?
Well, they're kind of my kids, so they're all important to me. And each one I learned something different, either through talking to an expert or digging into the research. I'll just say one of the ones that I'm finding a lot of people engage with, there's 2. Actually, it depends on the audience.
Right,
it's hard for me to choose one. So will I lose my memory, I think, is something that most people worry about as they age. And I learned that both, even though half of us think we're going to get cognitive decline and dementia, only about 17% of people, even over 75, have even mild dementia. And so, we fear it more than the reality. And there's things that we can do to lower our risk factors for cognitive decline and dementia. And a lot of people think that it's inevitable. So I talk about what's normal healthy aging, the types of healthy habits that people can do to lower their risk factors, and the sort of practical advice. And then also, it is real. My friend's father had Lewy bodies dementia, so I tell the story of Courtney and how his family had to suffer watching him decline. So hopefully there's some good news and some real news in all of the chapters.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I really appreciated about the book, having been a caregiver myself, and now I'm starting to see some of the changes with aging, but especially in caring for my parents, there's some real hard issues, but you really get into them and you don't shy away from those subjects. But you do talk a lot about the second 50, which is, pretty optimistic that, there's a second 50 years of life. I mean, perhaps that's a little optimistic, but that this is not the winding down of your life. This is a new opportunity and a new way to really live and embrace life. What sort of issues did you find in that realm, and what sort of encouraging things did you find?
So back in the 1900s, life expectancy was about 50. And since then, we've gained an additional 30 years of life. Now, it's called the second 50. I'm not promising everybody that buys it will get exactly a 50 because we don't know how long we're going to live, Bruce. And I lay out why some people live longer than others according to the research and things to expect. I think there's one piece that many people don't realize. They look at aging as a negative time of life. And when we look at the happiness curve, people are happiest when they're young and when they're older. In fact, in your 40s and 50s, you're your least happy decades. So even though people may have health conditions, we ask them, are you healthy? And they say yes, because it's relative, right? They are healthy for where they are, or healthier compared to other people that they may know. And so this time of life both has its challenges, but also a little bit of freedom, in that maybe you're not worried about the things that you used to worry about. You maybe have a little bit more time than racing around in your 40s when you're trying to take care of your kids. And so I try to present both the good and the bad side of the bad parts.
Yeah, I've seen that chart as well, and I think it's very interesting because there is the stereotype of sort of the grumpy old person,
Yeah.
But it seems like a lot of what I've heard is that people accept where they are, and they've also lived long enough to know that things usually aren't as bad as they seem, or you have to make do with what you have. Is that something you found?
Yeah, even financially, if we look at people with very low income or assets, and we ask them how they're doing financially, they say they're doing okay. They're getting by. They've figured out how to live with what they have and are appreciative of what they can do. And I think there's certainly more we can do to support people, both in their health and through caregiving and through financial. But the fact is, as we really look at the data and we talk to older adults throughout this country, there's a lot of hope, even with the struggles.
Was there anything that struck you as a real key to living a happier second 50?
Well, a lot of people want to live a healthier second 50. And so one of the things that I looked at is, what's the research say about what we can do to maintain our health as we age and longevity? And so, probably not surprising to the people that are listening, there's a set of habits that if you have, you live longer and healthier. So these habits are eating right, exercising, not smoking, not drinking too much, and maintaining a healthy body weight. And if you do those 5, you live over a decade longer, and you live also much healthier. But even if you do one of those habits, you live an additional 2 years. So any little bit helps. But Bruce, what I think was shocking to me was more important than eating right or exercise are things like our relationships and our mindsets. So our mindsets matter way more than I could have imagined. If you have a positive view on aging, so Bruce, if I ask you, what are the 5 words that you think of when I talk about an older person? And if they're positive and you say they're wise and they're experienced and they're loving, you can come up with your own set of words. You live 7.5 years longer than if your list was on negative words. And so if you view aging as a time of connection and ability to give back to your community, and you look forward to it, you take better care of yourself. And so it's not just that you live 7.5 years longer, you have a lower risk of heart attacks. And even the research shows that people who have this positive mindset have a larger brain volume, are less likely to get dementia. So mindset is really key. I also talked to some researchers from Harvard that looked at people in their 80s and said, well, okay, what's the difference between the healthy people in their 80s and those that had poor health? And they looked back at what happened to them in their 50s to see if there was something that happened earlier in life. And what they found was that it was the difference in having good relationships in your 50s really explained your health in your 80s. So another thing that is a health behavior is spending time with friends and family, getting to know others, being engaged in your community, volunteering. All of those things we know help us to be healthy. And in fact, the opposite is true. If you feel socially isolated, it's the same as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So these are the types of things that are really based on research that I talk about in several of the chapters.
Wow, that really shows the power of mindset. I mean, I think most people hear smoking 15 cigarettes, and we all know that's bad. But you're saying the power of your attitude and the power of how you approach aging is really that powerful?
It's really that powerful. I just wrote a Wall Street Journal editorial about this, and I sent it in, and they're like, we don't really believe the data. So I sent them more and more research, and Dr. Becca Levy, who's at Yale, has been leading a lot of this research, and they've showed it in other countries, across different populations, across all kinds of different measures. Hundreds and hundreds of studies have found this relationship between your mindset and your health.
Wow. All right, I'm going to have to go out and improve all of my relationships. One of our big focuses here in Washington State is family caregiving and how that can be a better experience and more successful for people. And I know that you've had some personal experience along with your policy experience. What sort of things could be better for family caregivers here in Washington and across the country?
So I mentioned I grew up in Eastern Washington. My mom was a caregiver for my grandmother who lived with us, and my mom was her caregiver for 50 years. My grandmother had schizophrenia, but was loving and kind, and really influenced my career in working in aging by having that close of a relationship. And we were lucky. She had Medicaid and SSI, so if her health got bad and she needed to go to the hospital, she had programs that helped support her. And my parents were still able to send us to college. If we didn't have programs like that, the costs would have been prohibitive. And we see so many families having to sort of decide with whether they're going to take care of their loved one or continue working, or pay for nursing homes, which can be hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, or memory care, which would be several hundreds thousands of dollars per year. So the effect on family caregivers of not having programs beyond Medicaid that can help take care of people for things like driving to appointment, or helping get out of bed, or having a meal made for them. All of the sort of non-medical care that people need as they age can be really, really drastic. What I'm excited about, and what I want to give Washington State a shout out, and particularly AARP Washington, because I know you guys have been champions, is the Washington Cares model. By having a program that will give resources to families and individuals to make decisions about, do I want to pay a caregiver? Do I want to pay a family member to help me? Do I want to need to modify my home so that I can stay where I am and can live there longer and safer? Having a program that's going to support family caregivers. I think you have 820,000 family caregivers here in Washington. Like this is revolutionary, and Washington is a huge leader by having this kind of a program being developed.
I think one thing people think is, it'll work out somehow, like it worked out for my parents, or or it's all too big, it's all too scary, I'm just not going to think about it. What would you say to that?
It's hard to think I'm going to need care in the future. Nobody wants to need help, right? We all want to be independent and be able to care for ourselves. But the research is strong that at some point in our lives, whether we fall and break a hip, one of my high school friends' mom was walking the dog, and the dog saw a squirrel and took off, and she went flying and broke her shoulder and hip, and she had been extremely healthy. But for months afterwards, my friend Kim had to take care of her mom. And so these changes can happen in an instant, and we never know when we're going to need a little extra help. So, and some of us will need it for years, and some of us will need help for months. But either way, it's expensive.
Yeah, and I think all of us have heard people who need care at younger ages
Yeah.
than we would have thought. Is that something you found was pretty common?
Well, people like my grandmother needed care her whole life. So there's a lot of people that develop disabilities or need assistance, from very young ages and age into needing help as an older adult. So, this is an issue I think that touches a lot of families and a lot of people from different generations. And Bruce, if we better support family caregivers, it actually helps our whole economy. Somebody having to quit their job so that they can take care of somebody, there's a cost to that, not just for the person who then isn't contributing to Social Security or saving for their own future, but really for society as a whole. My team estimated that if we supported caregivers over age 50, who to remain in the workforce, we could grow our GDP by over 5%.
Wow.
Yeah, so this is huge numbers of economic growth that would benefit everyone.
Wow. Is caregiving, and then also the other chapters of your book, there's things that people can do themselves, for themselves in their own situation, but there's also parts of it that we really need all of us, or we need a societal solution. Where do you see the balance there?
It depends on the program, right? Like you, Bruce, need to eat healthy, exercise, and have a better mindset. That's not a societal change. That's a personal lifestyle change. But I want to know that Social Security is going to pay me a benefit, and that's not a personal change. That's so I can plan for my future. Now, let me be clear, Social Security is not going bankrupt. I hate it when the media says that because it's just not true. But there will be a shortfall. So Social Security can only pay out what is coming in. And in about 2034, the year I turned 64, so it feels a little relevant, there won't be a full amount coming in to pay out full benefits. And so we need to get Congress and the president and policymakers to really take this seriously, because the sooner they are able to make the program not just solvent, but really adequate so we have something that can support us, the better, the easier the choices are. So we need to continue to push that. And so, that's, while I'm out there fighting for it all the time on behalf of AARP, it's not something I personally or you personally can change in our lives.
You have in the book a lot of great stories of people you've talked to, of research institutes you've been to, or towns you've been to where people are doing exciting things. Is there anything that stands out to you as a positive story that you were excited about?
Oh, there's so many. I'll do one small picture and one big picture. So the big picture is a lot of cities and communities, I know several here in Washington, are becoming age-friendly. And they're thinking of, okay, what in my town do we need to do to help support an aging population? Because demographic change is happening everywhere. There's no part of America where demographic change, actually there's no part of the world where the aging population isn't growing. And so when we see local communities really think through, okay, well, we've got bus stops, but we don't have one in front of the senior center. We don't have one that goes from the senior center to the hospital or to the places that people need it, and rethink things that people will need as they age. It can be incredibly empowering. So that's kind of a big picture. And across the country now, we have over 900 cities, communities, and states that have become age-friendly. And then there's, little tiny things. When New York State did this, they were looking at Central Park and then where to put their benches. And they talked to the older adults, because that's part of this process, is you have to say, okay, well, what do you want in your community and what's important to you? And they said, well, we're going to put some more benches near the playgrounds. And people were like, no, actually, I would like a little quiet. So can you put some benches in some quiet spaces for me? Things like curb cuts that help all ages are also part of these types of policies.
You have long experience in the aging field, but What did you learn that surprised you?
So probably something every chapter. Either I knew things like women lived longer than men, but I didn't know why. But I'll tell you one story that had already written up part of the chapter about how everybody needs advanced directives, because that seemed like pretty factual, that everybody needs those pieces of paper. We know only half of the population have wills. That's a piece of paper they do need. Yeah. But I talked to a palliative care expert, Dr. Diane Meyer, and I said, okay, I'm going to write this. And she's that everybody needs their advanced directives. And she said, actually, Deb, we've just done some research that shows that they're not followed. They don't improve care, and in fact can be problematic. And I said, what do you mean? She said, well, during the pandemic, a lot of people had checked the box that says, I don't want to be ever put on a ventilator. And if that advanced directive went with them to the hospital and they had to, and somebody read that late at night, they could be taken off a ventilator that was keeping them alive. Because people never thought that maybe I'll go on and then off, or I'll do it when I'm healthy. And she also says we often fill these out when we're in a good state of health, making judgment about what we would accept in a bad state of health, and we may feel differently over time. So what she advised was talking to your loved ones about what's really important to you, and making sure that you have somebody that can speak up for you if you're incapacitated, that can look at the issue of the moment, and do for Bruce what Bruce would want in that situation.
Wow. Well, all right. So I'm going to have to go back and revisit that myself, because that was one thing I thought I knew too, that there are certain things that you need. Is it important to keep an open mind on aging then? I guess I would ask you that question.
It is, and again, I really look at the research. So all of the things I write about have an evidence base to make sure, what's working, what's not working for people, what do the data say, and then talking to people that work on these issues every day and that know them a lot deeper than I did. I just learned a lot, and then again, talking to people that were at various stages in aging. Or I talked to a woman, Terry Montgomery, who had dementia, and learned from her what it was like to have dementia. Or I talked to a palliative care nurse and asked her what it was like to be with somebody as they die. What does it look like when somebody is dying? And those are the types of things that I think we're curious about. But we don't often have the opportunity to have those conversations.
So if I could ask you, what single thing would you want to leave people with about the second 50? What would that be? Your life isn't over at 50. I think the reason I call it the second 50, I'm not promising that everybody has another 50 years, but just for people to reset their imagination about time and make sure that they are taking the second 50 as an opportunity in the same way they planned and thought through all of the issues in their first 50. I opened the book with the story of my husband, who was hiking in Colorado and had chest pains. And he's a teacher, so he had taken CPR training every single year and decided that this might be something serious. So he flagged down some other hikers, and they called 911, and he was just outside of Boulder, Colorado, and Rocky Mountain Rescue ran up and carried him down, and his heart stopped in the emergency room. And luckily, 2 stents later and a couple broken ribs from chest compressions, he was fine. And I tell that story because the beautiful result was, Glenn really realized he was doing what he wanted to do in life. He had a sense of purpose about being a teacher. He ended up writing over 50 letters to friends, families, teachers, mentors, coaches to thank them. So he developed an even deeper sense of gratitude. And for me, it made me realize that even though I do all this work for my second 50, we don't know how much time we have. And we need to keep, we need to plan for 50, but
make sure that we keep every day as special.
Yeah, that was a very affecting story. To be so young and to be in really good shape and to be doing something active, and then suddenly, to be in a medical crisis like that, it really does go to the question of how long will I live? But I mean, all these questions, we need to ask ourselves that, but we can't always know the answer.
We can't always know the answer. And Bruce, I just want to also let people know that all of the royalties go to AARP Foundation to help lower income older adults. So if you buy a copy of the book, you're actually helping people too.
And where can folks find a copy of the book?
So you can come to AARP's website, aarp.org/second50, and we have a whole list of booksellers, but you can buy it at your local bookstore or online.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the conversation. As always, I want to remind people about our AARP Washington Caregivers resource site, and that's aarp.org/caregiverswa. That's aarp.org/caregiverswa. Thank you once again, Deb. I really appreciate you sharing all the wisdom that you've gained in the course of the book. A lot to talk about, and perhaps you'll come back and talk to us again.
I'll take any excuse to come back to Washington to see my family. So thanks for having me, and it was a really great conversation. Thanks, Bruce.